Hello, welcome to the episode on the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vansky, and I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today is January 10th, 2023. This is episode 27. I'm delighted to have a guest who is well known in the economics community, who has been writing in a lot of spaces for a long time, who is a freedom fighter and a liberty warrior overall, is none other than Dr. John Cochrane. John, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's really a great pleasure to have you here today. We're going to talk a lot about his new book, The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, which comes out on January 17th when this will air. So it's a great timing overall. Also just a great timing given what's going on in the fiscal policy space, the monetary policy space, inflation, the economy. There's so much to talk about today. I'm really excited to have John on. But for the audience, let me go ahead and give you his bio. John H. Cochrane is the Rose Marie and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and an adjunct scholar of the Cato Institute. Before joining Hoover, Cochrane was a professor of finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business and earlier at its economics department. Cochrane earned a bachelor's degree in physics at MIT and PhD in economics at the University of California at Berkeley. He was a junior staff economist on the Council of Economic Advisors, 1982 to 1983. We were both at the White House for a little bit. Nice. Cochrane's recent publication include the book Asset Pricing and articles on dynamics in stock and bond markets, the volatility of exchange rates, the term structure of interest rates, returns to venture capital, liquidity premiums and stock prices, and a number of other areas in economics, including the fiscal theory of the price level. His monetary economics publications include articles on the relationship between the deficits and inflation, the effects of monetary policy, and the fiscal theory of the price level. He has also written articles on macroeconomics, health insurance, time series econometrics, financial regulations, and other topics, just all over the board. He's got a wealth of knowledge. He was a co-author of the Squam Lake Report. His asset pricing PhD class is available online via Coursera. Cochrane frequently contributes editorial opinion essays to the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg.com, and other publications. And he maintains the Grumpy Economist blog. First of all, John, are you really that grumpy?
No,
No.
Except on rare occasions.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah. Well, I've been reading the blog for a number of years, and so I've really enjoyed the way you explain things, break things down, but just your perspective on things. And I wonder what really motivates you to do the things that you do each and every day.
It's fun. Gotta be honest. Economics is a great adventure, and there's nothing more than I like than figuring out a puzzle of some aspect of fiscal theory that I can't make work today, and then going back to the blog and railing off on some aspect of how things are not run well from our free market point of view. What else could you want to do in life? And then they pay me at the end of the day. So right. Yeah, that's fantastic. And what got you started in economics? Was it a particular class or just trying to understand more about the world? What got you started? So procedurally, I got started in that I finished physics at MIT and knew I didn't want to do that. Had taken an economics course as my undergraduate humanities distribution requirement. So I said, that's fun. Let's go do that. But I recognized in myself I had become an economist earlier. It's sort of a conversion moment to economics when you recognize this is what you should do. One for me was in a class, so just seeing how the budget constraint of someone works who lives on welfare at the time. That if they take away, if you earn an extra dollar, they take away $1 worth of benefits. And I suddenly, hallelujah, there, but for the grace of God go I. This isn't something about culture. It's just there's the budget constraint. You can explain deep social problems with clear, value-free, non-political, non-ethical, moral analysis. That was great. So that was one of I had a couple more conversion experiences, but that was a key one.
Well, no, that sounds like a good one to me. Mine was really this let people prosper was kind of my calling. To be given God's grace and everything else going on was something I just feel compelled to do. And economics seemed to just tell so much about how the world works, to your point, right? Because the economy is nothing really more than people. We could break it down in these models and abstract notions, but really it's just understanding how people behave and interact and things of that nature. I wonder, given all the experiences that you've had and you've worked in a lot of areas of policy, of just economics in general, what got you really into, this fiscal theory of the price level or in monetary policy, those sort of things?
So this has actually been a 40-year quest. And I tell the story in the book of starting out on a puzzle in a beautiful day in 1980, talking with my colleagues. Monetary economics economics is such a puzzle, and it's clear we don't really understand where inflation comes from. So I'll have to admit it was the beauty of the thing and the puzzle sitting there that just needed to be solved of where does inflation really come from in our economy. I recognized even in 1980 the stories we were telling didn't really work, and it seemed like just a hard to solve nut that I couldn't put away. So I was for years trying to find this issue. How do we make a theory of inflation that works for the economy the way we see it, the way it actually works today? The theories that I was being taught clearly didn't apply to the economy that I looked out the window. So that's just a puzzle that I couldn't put down. And then bit by bit, we all collect ideas. I stood on the shoulders of giants, picked up a little from Mike Woodford, a little there from Eric Leeper, a little from Chris Sims, a little from Tom Sargent, and just kept plugging away on it. There's this grand puzzle of putting it together. I could sort of see a vision of how we were going to do a theory of inflation that would hold together and work for today's economy. And I'm also attracted to the aesthetic part. I like Chicago economics, simple supply and demand. If you just work a little harder, works to explain all sorts of stuff that looks puzzling. And I knew it was right out there over the horizon, and that surely next year, I'll work a little more on it. And year after year went by, and here we are. And there's still all sorts of stuff I don't understand. This is kind of, I took a breath and put down what I know now, but plenty to go here. So this one was really a fascinating intellectual puzzle. I'd love to say, I did it to solve some great pressing social problem. But the pressing social problems are economic growth. Inflation is not, it's a bad one, but I really was motivated by, I thought I could see a way somewhere out there to fix this and give us a really nice, pretty and operational theory of inflation.
Well, I like the way you put that, of how it's a puzzle and you're trying to piece together this puzzle. I can just almost see your mind. If you've seen the Beautiful Mind movie about John Nash, and he's putting these puzzle pieces together on the windows, right? And I can just kind of seeing you doing that over the years as you're taking into it. Right.
He went a little bit nuts in the process. So
he did. Not that you did that. but just piecing.
That is the research process. Is just puzzle after puzzle. Something doesn't work, and then you spend the days figuring it out. And now I see how it works. So if you find that fun, you'll like doing economic research.
Well, that's exactly right. And it's one of the things I love about economics is there's always a new puzzle to solve each and every day as we go through this. And, with monetary theory, there's been a lot of writing on this, on inflation and different routes of how this is brought about and where inflation comes from. You have the Monetary History of the United States by Milton Friedman. You've got the classical sort of views. You've got the equation of exchange. You've even got the newer, modern monetary theory, right? That really talks about that it's not created by the Federal Reserve. You can print as much money as you wanted to. You can just tax people more and bring that money out of the economy, and that reduces inflation. I think that's more of in many ways, an ideology compared to a sound theory. But there's a lot of things that are going on with that. I know that the way you put it was that the way that money gets value is by paying taxes. And I wondered, if you wouldn't mind expanding on that, because when I first read it, just to be honest with you, I almost thought back to MMT, is they're talking a little bit about how that value comes from the dollar and being able to pay taxes with it. And I don't think that's where you're coming down, and I know it's not. And so what are some of the distinctions for you about money and where this process gets started?
Yeah, we should, if anybody's been patient enough to listen to us this far, we should explain to them what the idea is.
Yes, please.
The basic concept in fiscal theory of the price level, where does inflation come from? And the answer is it comes really from the overall quantity of government debt relative to how much people think the government will pay off that debt. So it works very much like stocks. What's stock worth? Well, there's how many shares and there's how many dividends you think the company's going to pay for those shares. Kind of divide it, you get the stock price. Same concept. And intuitively, why? Suppose we're sitting on $30 trillion of government debt, and we look around and we say, our government might be good for 20 trillion, but they're not going to be able to pay off 30 trillion. So what do? Well, you try to get rid of your government debt quick before the value falls, right? And so individually we can. I can sell it to you. You can try to sell it to someone else, but collectively we can't. And so, like the famous hot potato analogy, to try to get rid of it, we got to end up buying stuff. Well, there's only so much stuff to go around. So as we try to get rid of government debt overall, we drive up the price level. until it's back to, as the price level goes up, as inflation eats away at the value of that debt, now it's worth it's worth 20 trillion in old money once the inflation has gone up. And then, well, the government can raise that much in real revenues, and that's where we are, which pretty much was just happened. I was extraordinarily fortunate to have a book in print when our government sent $5 trillion worth of money in government debt to people as checks. The result was inflation. The inflation has eroded the value of government debt right back down to where it was before this whole business started, which is what people thought the government was good for. So that's the basic idea. Now we have to elaborate. Why is this 538 pages of equations? Take that basic idea and make it practical, make it useful. You got to think about the Federal Reserve, which remains powerful, and monetary policy. You got to think about all the different kinds of economies we've seen. We got to come up with a story for the events we've seen over the past, from the current inflation, the zero bound era, the inflation of the 60s and 70s. So there's a lot to do with that fundamental concept. Now, the second question you'd ask is, how is that different from other theories, which I'll try to go really quick with, but it certainly helps to understand what am I trying to say.
Yeah.
The most important theory is monetarism, it comes from too much money chasing too few goods. And that sounds a lot the same. In fact, they were 90% right too. We both agree if you print $5 trillion of money and drop it from helicopters, you get inflation. Because I would say money is a form of government debt. If you dropped $5 trillion worth of, if people got a account in a mutual fund that holds government debt, and you drop that from helicopters, people go out and spend it, and you would also get inflation. The key proposition for monetarists is that inflation doesn't come from the overall amount of debt, but from the composition. That if the government gives you some money, but takes back the same amount of treasuries, that's going to go make you spend. Oh, wait a minute. You got $1,000 worth of treasuries. The government gives you $1,000 in cash, but takes away your $1,000 of treasuries. It's not so obvious. That's going to go make you spend. And that's the crucial difference, is that the total amount of government debt, or the amount that is held in one specific form versus another kind of. Now, the modern monetarists, too, they have an insight, and the insight isn't mine or theirs. It goes back to Adam Smith, actually. It's a beautiful Adam Smith quote that starts the whole book. If there's too much money floating around causing inflation, too much money and too much government debt, what the government can do is soak some of it back up with taxes. That gets rid of it. So ultimately, money is valuable. Government debt is valuable because April 15th, you got to come up with some of this stuff. And that's, the government creates it. If there's too much, it can soak it up with taxes. The modern monetarists took that one right ingredient and mixed it with about 99 other wrong ingredients. And didn't go through the discipline of writing down the equations, of connecting it with everything else we know about monetary policy, and took it to wrong conclusions, such as, they said the government can print up all the money you want, borrow and spend all you want, and you won't get inflation. I think there's a quote from Stephanie Kelton, because there always is slack in the U.S. economy, present tense. Well, we ran out of slack, and I think they ran out of ideas. So, that's why solving all the puzzles, putting it all together, making sure the equations work is important in monetary economics.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And I think that those are things that I gleaned from the book as well, and continue to expand on my thinking of it. But I'm wondering, because the way that I've kind of thought about with this whole approach that we've seen in the last couple of years, and even in the past, is that, the Federal Reserve, it really gets its power because of the Treasury securities that are out there, the amount of debt that the Fed or that Congress has created over time. If you didn't have that same amount of debt, they wouldn't have the assets to buy. Now, maybe they could find other assets in the process to create their increasing the balance sheet, putting money in the economy, but that there's this connection between the fiscal theory and the monetary theory. I know you and I worked in the White House. I was at OMB for about a year in the Trump administration. You were in the Council of Economic Advisors for at least a year, maybe 2 years under the Reagan administration. And you see the flow of kind of funds, what's going on in Congress, the budgets and everything else. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about your approach with the fiscal theory of the price level is that you have this active versus passive sort of policy. And when you're thinking about the fiscal side, which is government spending and taxation, running deficits over time, is that if there's a deficit now, there's an expectation of surpluses in the future in order to pay it back. And more of the unexpected inflationary or unexpected shocks of the deficits will lead to the inflationary pressure, right? And I'm just trying to see if I can summarize it, and then I want you to go into details to see if I'm heading in the right direction. But that a lot of this is driven by what the the Congress is doing through deficits and the unexpected deficits that lead to the inflationary pressures that, the Fed has some control over inflation expectations that are kind of given over time. But how do you really explain those connections there?
So the Fed, in a fiscal theory of the price level, the Fed remains, and the Fed, so your first instinct is, wait a minute, this is all about fiscal policy. The central bank is completely useless. No, now it's not nearly as powerful as Milton Friedman thought it was, but it remains powerful. Why? Because it sets this interest rate target. So by setting the nominal interest rate, which is just look out the window, obvious, the Fed sets the nominal interest rate, that has effects on the economy. We have to have that in a theory. We do, not a problem for fiscal theory. Now, the second thing you mentioned, the Federal Reserve can buy assets and issue money. And from the starting point of the fiscal theory, that is much more questionable whether it has any effect at all, because I like to call them open change operations. It is pretty much like you have $20 bills, and for every 20, I give you 2 5s and a 10. That's what the Fed does. You have treasuries, and in return for treasuries, the Fed gives you overnight interest-bearing reserves, which are, the Fed is nothing but a giant money market fund. Its interest-bearing reserves are an account, and it backs that account with treasuries. So do you really care if you have treasuries in your safe or in your treasuries in your brokerage account, or you have a money market fund that it holds treasuries? That's much less obvious. Now, there are frictions in the financial system. Sometimes you really need 2 5s and a 10, not a 20. But we are so awash in interest-bearing reserves right now. They're up from 10 billion before the financial crisis to, I think, like 4 trillion today. So you got enough 5s and 20s to pay anything that might come along. It's really hard to think that difference makes on. Now, this is, we're going to make some predictions here that are out of the ordinary. Most of Wall Street thinks that QE is absolutely, it's like fire. It's certainly, like in many places in economics, there's a neutrality theorem that says something that everyone else thinks really ought to matter really shouldn't matter at all. And then there's, you got to put in those frictions that make it matter to some extent. But it's much less clear than you think. Now, then you move down to fiscal policy. Yes, Congress, the Fed is not completely in charge of inflation, and Congress has a lot to do with it. And that is fairly radical relative to monetary economics since about the 1960s. In the 1950s, which we seem to be going back to on the left, it was all about wage price spirals and job boning and unions and distributional conflicts and so forth. And then Milton Friedman came along and said, no, it's all the central bank. Well, we're going to back off now. It's a little bit the central bank to the interest rate target, but it is a lot about Congress and debt and deficits. And I think we just, again, thank you. I'm sorry, my fellow citizens, for the pain you've gone through, but thank you, Congress, for and the Trump and Biden administrations for proving my point. The $5 trillion that they spent during the pandemic was not monetary policy. I mean, and nobody is thinking that this inflation came because the Fed did something. Now, maybe they were asleep at the switch a little bit with interest rates, but it's not that they did something. Inflation came from somewhere else. And that's exactly what fiscal theory says. Sometimes inflation comes from central bank mistakes, but sometimes it comes from a fiscal blowout. And we just saw one. And the last point, I'm sorry, you asked so many good questions. I'm rambling, going on in the answer.
You're good.
Good questions. Now, the first reaction to fiscal theory is, wait a minute, you're saying the deficits cause inflation? There's sorts of times when we see deficits and there's no inflation. Like, the big one after the financial crisis, big deficit, no inflation. There's no relationship between debt or deficit. Some countries have huge debts. Look at Japan, no inflation. Other countries have small debts, Argentina, Turkey, big inflation. There's no correlation of debt and deficits with inflation. Exactly. What matters is not today's debt or deficits, but today's debt or deficits relative to what people think will be repaid in the future. The US government can borrow and spend an enormous amount of money in a crisis if the US government can persuade people, look, we're good for it. This is a strong country. We can raise the necessary taxes, cut the future spending. We can pay back that debt. If you convince people today's deficits correspond to tomorrow's sober plan to repay it, borrow a lot, spend a lot. That's what we do during crises. Where the trouble comes is when people aren't convinced that today's deficits will be followed by tomorrow's repayment. Then that kind of deficit causes inflation, or you might not have a big deficit today. If people just wake up and say, oh boy, these guys are just not good for it. Guys and gals are just not good for it. This thing's going to blow up. Then inflation seems to come from nowhere. That's harder. So because it's much harder to tell us sitting in our offices. When do people, bond markets, lose their faith in a government's long-term ability to repay? But that's the central question. And that's why it's not quite so simple as deficit inflation, and not so simple to solve. A little bit of temporary austerity like the Brits are trying, good luck to them. But you need to persuade people you're in it for the long haul, not just that we're going to, have a little show of deficit reduction today.
Yeah, and I guess that's what's kind of difficult sometimes, especially given Congress and their different incentives that are in place to spend more, tax less in the process, running up deficits. It makes it less clear that they will run surpluses or pay down the debt over time. How can we build that into the model to say, look, we might not bring down the deficits, but I think the way, from what I understood from your explanation in the book, was that it's also the reduction in deficits over time, at least heading towards a balanced budget, even if you're not getting to a balanced budget, that can be deflationary or not as disinflationary as it was in the past. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Most of all, people need to have confidence, not in a precise plan. You don't need an image of everybody sits out there with a computer and says, what's the deficit going to be in the year 2035?
Okay. Yeah.
We need confidence in a stable political system that will, one way or another, prioritize repaying and not inflating away debt. And that's difficult. And the other thing I'll bring up here, though, is that the other insight is that monetary and fiscal policy are intertwined. And so the Fed does have a role in bringing down inflation. But those two things have to dance together. And this is going to be much more important in the next couple of years than it was in the past. When the Fed raises interest rates, that raises the amount of interest the government has to pay on its debt. And that used to not be such a big deal. Now it's a big deal. When our debt is 100% of GDP, if the Fed raises interest rates 1 percentage points, that's 1% of GDP of extra deficit that the Fed now inflicts on the Treasury. Our government sort of has the adjustable rate mortgage, and when interest rates go up, you got to pay more. That was a big mistake, but it's kind of too late now to go get the fixed rate mortgage. So that's each percentage point there is $250 billion of extra deficit. That's big. And if the government doesn't come up with that much more taxes minus spending in order to pay it, now monetary policy can't, that it's going to create more of the same deficits that are causing us problems.
Yeah.
If the Fed causes a recession, what's the government going to want to do? Bailout, stimulus. Well,
right.
It got us in the problems in the first place. So there's the three insights. One is that inflation can come from the Fed, but it also can come from fiscal blowouts on its own. And the other one is that monetary and fiscal policy are now intertwined. And so the Fed really, whether it can do this all on its own is much more questionable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, John. And I wonder, so this is the way that I've been thinking about it for a while. And I think it kind of goes along with what you're saying with the fiscal theory of the price level, but maybe you could tell me how I'm wrong. Where, you have Congress run deficits and they increase the number of treasuries that are out there in the market. The Fed buys those treasuries. They put dollars out into the marketplace with their open market operations. That increases the money supply. And if goods and services don't increase at the same rate, then you're going to get inflationary pressures that are out there. Because my thinking has been that government spending doesn't really increase the number of dollars in circulation, because it's just coming out of the private sector, whether through the payment of bonds, whether through higher taxes in the future or current taxes. It's really almost a redistribution of dollars throughout the system is the government spending. And even if you cut taxes, this is just a redistribution of the dollars throughout the economy, not necessarily this idea of too much money chasing too few goods. And in my thinking, and you're challenging my thinking on this, is that the way that the Congress and their fiscal policy leads to the inflationary pressure was that the Fed then comes out, prints those dollars like I started with, right, and buys those treasuries, puts more money in the economy, and then that increases the inflationary pressures that are in the economy, not necessarily the fiscal policy side of things. But I think that's different than what you're saying. Where am I going wrong?
Yeah, I give you an A+ for monetarism.
Okay.
You will come back from the grave and give you a blessing.
Yeah.
So this is the central issue. And I think reality is halfway in between our 2 points. But I like to start with a clear, simple one and then make it more complicated. Is there an important difference between money and government debt? So let's just pick apart apart what you just said. The Treasury borrows a whole bunch of money and somehow and spends it. Maybe sends people checks, borrows this huge amount of money from Peter, sends a check to Paul. Now, you're saying that's not inflationary until the Federal Reserve buys that debt and turns it into more money. And that's what's not so obvious to me. Does the private economy really care if it's holding Treasury bills or if it's holding interest-paying reserves at the Fed? Both are government debt. The Treasury bill might have, 1 to 6 months maturity, might be a little less liquid, but we know how to make those things liquid now. Suppose that they're holding that in a mutual fund. So all these Treasuries, you're sitting, private economy, holding that in a mutual fund that you can spend anytime you want. Boy, that looks a lot like money. And in fact, a Treasury note, a Treasury bill, a government debt is just a promise to give you more money in the future. So when you look at it hard from 30,000 feet, really, is there a big difference between government debt and the government's money? And fiscal theory, which starts from basic principles, says no. As far as creating inflation, a promise that I will flood the economy with money tomorrow to pay off this debt is no different than flooding the economy with that money today. That the composition, whether money is just government debt, it's overnight government debt, that the composition of government debt between being overnight and being 6 months or a year doesn't matter that much compared to the overall amount. Whereas the extreme fiscal theory says, no, all government debt relative to surpluses to pay off that debt doesn't really matter what the maturity of that debt is. The extreme monetarist says, no, matters absolutely. If it pays interest and it's called Treasury bill, it is debt. It doesn't cause inflation. People sit on it and that's their savings. If it's called money and has pictures of ex-presidents on it, even though now that pays interest, that's called money. That thing is inflationary. It's which one you're holding that causes inflation. Now, where's reality? I think reality is halfway in between. And that's, back sort of to the beginning of our conversation. The right way to do economics is to start with the simplest, clearest model, one that respects all of those famous neutrality theorems you read about in graduate school, and then try to see how reality might be different than this. So fiscal theory starts with, look, it's all the same thing. If there weren't any frictions in the economy, overall debt would matter. You wouldn't care about holding a piece of paper that says this is $1 versus a piece of paper that says I'll give you $1 next month. It's the same thing as far as you're concerned, right? It's kind of, as far as you're spending and saving and so forth, as long as you have lots of both. Then reality, the first one is a little more liquid. It's, you can get rid of it quicker, although getting rid of a treasury is pretty easy these days. In reality, who gets money? You said who gets, which I think is important. In the sort of first way we look at things, we kind of put all households together. It doesn't really matter if you get the check or if I get the check. Who cares if you spend something or I spend something, somebody spends something. Well, in reality, who gets the money matters. And I think some of the inflation we got, it really mattered that it was because the government sent people checks that went to their bank accounts that they could spend right away. Well, that's an extra wrinkle on top of the model. We took money from people who invested as bondholders and we sent it to people who were going to spend it. That had something to do with the inflation coming faster than it would have otherwise. But those are I like let's go back to, we start with supply and demand. Yeah. The clearest model, which is a very counterintuitive world to the average person. You really get that one. And then you build to reality by adding those, second order effects as important. But it's good economics starts with the no frictions and then adds the second order effects rather than just assume that everything is in the world of frictions and there's no supply and demand.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that there. And I think right now, we have this period where over the last 3 years, the deficit's increased by about $7 trillion, massive amount of money that's there. You've had the Fed's balance sheet increase by $5 trillion. And so one of the things that I started looking at early on during this period, of course, were the checks. And I was a part of some of those discussions that were going on and paycheck protection program and all this money that was being put into the economy. But one of the things that, in economics, there was this discussion about transitory versus persistent inflation. And at least the way that I was looking at it back then, it was I was not a fan of the checks going out, especially in just the helicopter drop to everyone. If they should have been more targeted from my view. But I wasn't sure that was going to create the inflationary pressures. But what I then saw was that the Fed increased their balance sheet pretty quickly at that time. $7 trillion, not dollar for dollar, the increases in treasury securities were on the Fed's balance sheet because some of that was mortgage-backed securities and some other areas. this agency debt, for example. But from my view early on, this was always going to be persistent inflation, just given the dynamics of what I was looking at least from the Fed's perspective, and how the deficits, though, because I do think the fiscal theory really matters here, is that the deficits were going to continue to expand. I mean, even though the deficit was down by over, it was cut in half over a year, it's still over $1 trillion. These are still massive deficits that we're having. And I wonder then where this is going to go next. I mean, I've been pushing the Fed to do things more aggressively on Twitter and elsewhere. They've come down from $8.9 trillion on their balance sheet to about $8.5 trillion. But interest rates, their target, the Fed funds rate, has went from 0 to 4.5, which I expect that it'll go at least to 5.5, maybe to 6. But so that's a huge move in their targeted interest rate, but their balance sheet really hasn't changed. And maybe this is more of my monetarism coming out, John, but I've really looked at the balance sheet more. I mean, to me, that's really where they're manipulating particular types of markets throughout the economy. Yes, the interest rates are important. I also go back to some of my Austrian views of the orders of production that influences. But when the Fed comes out and puts this money in different places in the economy, of who gets it, back to your point, I don't see inflation coming down at a rapid rate really anytime soon, maybe from a severe recession. But even then, the elevated pace of where the balance sheet is at gives me kind of pause of how quickly inflation will come down. What are some of your dynamics that you're looking at as we're starting to wrap up the show? I know it's a lot on you.
You asked me 5 questions.
But take your time. Take your time, though.
Yeah. You asked me 5. Again, this is great. I do want to put a marker down. So
okay.
Not all the checks were bad. Now, there was lots of horrible policy in the pandemic. We can go on about the CDC and the FDA and the lockdowns and all the rest of it some other day. But not letting the economy fall into a financial crisis was important. The Fed wildly overdid that. And someday we'll talk about the Fed propping up the entire corporate bond market and basically undoing all of the promises of 2008. But something was important. We did not want people dying in the street because we had closed down their jobs and they had nowhere to go. But it was vastly overdone, as you said. Money was sent out to everybody, not just to people in need, and that's why we got inflation. But we don't want to go down as heartless people who thought absolutely nothing needed to be done.
Sure. Yeah, you're right.
Now, you and I are still going back and forth about does it matter that the Fed bought a lot of this stuff. I was a little appalled that the Fed did, in fact, after all of the Dodd-Frank Act and all of that stuff, stepped in and said, oh, wow, the treasury markets, we have to step in and buy all the treasuries because we don't like the interest rates. And the Fed did, in fact, buy most of the new issues. So that also leads me to wonder, there's a tipping point out there where people don't want to hold more U.S. treasuries, especially in the next crisis. And the fact that the Fed had to step in because no one else was buying treasuries, I think is a big warning sign that the next crisis might be even worse as far as that grand moment when people refuse to buy U.S. government debt. But I'm still going to fight you a little bit on, is the balance sheet itself just that important as opposed to the total amount of government debt there. And so but you're asking me, let's think about the future and persistence. In fact, so what we've seen is that the inflation came and then the inflation's starting to ease. And I did go out on a limb a little bit earlier in the year because fiscal theory says if you have a one-time fiscal blowout, and the 5 trillion was bigger than the 1 trillion that we have now, what happens is you inflate away that much debt and then it goes away on its own, even when the Fed doesn't do anything. So there was beautiful plots in the book, which look gorgeous unless you think about what they're saying, where the Fed leaves interest rates alone, inflation comes and then inflation goes away. And traditional monetary theory says, traditional interest rate theory says that unless the Fed raises interest rates above the current rate of inflation, inflation will spiral out of control. Now we haven't talked about interest rate theories of inflation, but that is the conventional wisdom. I love your monetarism because I came from Chicago, but conventional wisdom looks just at interest rates and says that if inflation starts and the Fed does not raise interest rate more than current inflation spirals out of control. And fiscal theory says, no, that's not right. It's just a one-time fiscal shock will inflate away the debt, and then it will go away slowly on its own without the Fed doing anything. And in particular, without the Fed raising interest rates more than inflation. And that seems to be happening. It's not as transitory as team transitory thought. It's not just supply shock shocks. It's not just greed. It's not just the chicken farmers monopolizing the chicken industry and sending the prices up. All of those excuses. It's not the dog ate my homework. It is a one-time huge demand shock that works its way through the economy, but then can go away before the Fed does much better. And I'm gratified to see that some of that decline is coming as this whole business has been very difficult for me because the equations scream things that I don't understand and believe. And the equations have screamed for a couple of years now. If the Fed leaves interest rates alone, inflation will eventually melt away. That's so hard to swallow. Everything I've been taught, everything you've been taught says that isn't true.
Right.
But then, the zero bound era came and the Fed left interest rates alone and inflation didn't spiral out of control. And once again, the Fed is very late to the party. And all conventional wisdom says we should be Venezuela by now. But inflation is kind of coming down on its own. But that's where the good news ends.
Yeah.
And I think your intuition was right. And you said something very clever. It's not just the current deficit. Your worry is that we're going back to $1 trillion a year deficits. And now people will say, well, we had $1 trillion a year deficits throughout the 2010s. That didn't cause inflation. But there was a lot of what they like to call tailwinds in Federal Reserve speak. And in particular, the tailwind of people willing to lend the government lots of money at extremely low interest rates. Governments are just like your wayward in-laws who are maxed out on their credit cards, and they're fine as long as the interest payments are low. And that's really what got us through the 2010s. That's what keeps Japan going forever. But then when interest rates go up, then you've got that huge amount of debt, and you're in trouble. So it's not obvious to me that tailwind is going to be with us. So as I think about it, what the Fed is doing can help inflation now, but at the cost of kind of entrenching us into a 4% inflation. So my rough guess is that it'll come down to something like in the 4% range, and then any more will be very difficult for the Fed to do all on its own. It needs that coordinated monetary and fiscal policy we talked about, and then something bad's going to happen. I mean, that's just I've lived on this earth for 65 beautiful years. Something always bad happens. And that's where I really get worried, is in the next shock. Our government's response to any shock is simply, we're going to borrow and print a ton of money and throw it out there. And I think the big lesson is we just found out the limits of that strategy. And so I'm not so sure. My rough guesstimate, heaven knows you can't forecast inflation or anything much in the economy. So it's dangerous business. But, I think we can get back. I look at 1975 as a historical analog. Inflation came down on its own, but not all the way. And then something bad happened, an oil price shock. And so I think I think it'll go down once we inflate away the massive amount of stuff that was handed out, the $5 trillion of the pandemic. We sort of come back to normal times, which is a deficit that's too big, but isn't, so big that all on its own, it's causing big inflation. So we go down to a steady inflation, and then the next bad shock happens. And then I'm truly worried that, can you imagine? China starts a blockade on Taiwan. Financial crisis like you've never seen. Trade throughout the Pacific going nowhere. Let's have the Ukraine war go badly. Something else happens. All of a sudden, Uncle Sam goes to the markets and says, "Oh, I need another 5-10 trillion to bail out all, because once again, we promised we fix this. Sorry, no, guys. We got to bail out the entire financial markets." And then stimulus, and then maybe we got to borrow some money to actually do some military spending. But we're starting at this huge amount of debt we have now, and we just kind of veered the car off the edge of the cliff once, and that cliff looks like to me like that cliff is a lot closer. So that's my 2:00 in the morning worry. So again, I want to keep you away from just the problem of the current deficits, but the unresolved plan of how are we going to get back to normal, which is, the unresolved plan of entitlements, of a tax code that has too high marginal rates that are killing the economy, but not enough actual revenue to pay off the bonds. It's that kind of simple structural reform that you, me, and your grandma could do together in about 5 minutes, but the U.S. seems to want to do after we've tried everything else.
Yeah, great points, John. And I've learned so much from this discussion and from reading your book, and I'm going to keep reading the book, Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. Everyone should go and buy a copy as it goes on sale on January 17th, 2023. Good overall discussion here. And, I'm hopeful in some sense, kind of leaving this with some optimism that, Republicans are taking the House, although I don't always have that much optimism about either party actually constraining spending. But that's something that we need. One of the things I've also been kind of really into is spending limits, some sort of fiscal rule that we can get back on to make sure that we don't have these unexpected deficits. But you're right. I mean, we're always going to have some sort of shock, and the inclination is always to try to take care of it as, government as a first resort, when I oftentimes think they should be more of a last resort, whether it be from, safety net programs or other types of things. We should really have a more robust economy, a flourishing civil society to help people out. And then hopefully one day, some sort of fiscal, of monetary rules as well. Kind of in closing here, what would you like to leave the audience with on any sort of hopeful thoughts or rules or whatever else you'd like to say about the book there, John?
Well, I think your attitude is one I will celebrate, that it's not just about what do we do now, it's putting in place regular order. Let's start with just passing budgets. The 12 appropriations bills. We have a budget act. We could start following the rules for a change before we start on, term limits and fiscal rules and monetary rules. Let's just, obey the rules that we've got.
Right.
But good economic policy, the central insight of brilliant insight of macro in my generation, in the generation just before me, was that people think over time, and that policy is not about the action you take today. It's about the rules, the system, the Constitution, the civil society, the things that work year in and year out, and those absolutely need mending. And I will put in one last plug, not just the book, which I hope everyone will go out and buy and read. If you go to my website, johnhcochrane.com, you'll find essays that are good introductions for the lay reader. The book's full of equations. It also has lots of fun stuff, but there are equations in there to try to persuade my fellow economists this is how they should do economics. That's necessary to have a scientifically valid theory and not just something that makes a little splash and goes away. But the essays also are there to help you understand how to use this and how this applies in the real world.
Perfect. Well, I will also put all these links on our show notes page at vancegien.substack.com, where you can subscribe to my newsletter as well. And if you enjoyed this discussion, please give us a 5-star rating, as that's really helpful with these podcasts. And but John, thank you for all you do. God bless you and your family. I look forward to continue to learn and dive in more to this book and the research that's going to come out of it over a long period of time. We've got a lot more to learn about the economy and how people behave. So for the audience, thank you for being here. Let people prosper.